decades after I was in your classroom, perhaps for the same course. Uh,
Yes.
it tells me something about the temporality of the places we inhabit, and I'm almost back in the same place 20 years later.
Yes.
And it's great to be meeting you all, a whole new generation of students working in planning and sort of aspiring to become future urbanists and urban thinkers, urban researchers, as well as urban planners and urban professionals. And as you know, because there is a great need for urban professionals in the country today, there are barely some 600 planners officially in the country. So I'm sure all of you have your job sort of cut out for you in future. And of course, it is also the nature of urbanization in India that's kind of rapidly kind of changing. I don't have to sort of tell you, although we are at what 33% urban in terms of population, but the complexity of our urban settlements are something which are beyond the grasp of theories or beyond the grasp of existing kind of models, beyond the grasp of even the kind of planning thought that's there. Essentially, that's also because a lot of this planning thought and theory comes from the West. And these models that we sort of hear about, models of urban planning, again are sort of Western dominated models. So at the center where I belong, we've been trying to sort of understand urbanization in all its kind of complexity, especially looking at trying to research smaller and medium towns in India, because we believe that they deserve a certain different kind of treatment, a different kind of approach, rather than the way we approach the mega cities. So the mega cities, of course, bring their own set of problems, their own set of issues, and but there's a lot of focus, a lot of writing, a lot of research that you'll probably find on Delhi, that you'll probably find on Mumbai, but you'll rarely find on, say, Vijayawada, or a small town, say, somewhere in the northeast, perhaps, right? So, in that sense, that's something that our center tries to do. What our center also tries to do is try and develop from these empirical cases ways of understanding, urbanization, and how to approach the urban complexities from our own understanding and our own sort of vernacular ways of understanding how cities work, what is working, what is not, why are certain things working and why are certain things not. So in that sense, we also look at policy. We look at the intersections of policy and governance, and of course, being a TIS, we sort of uphold the need to sort of look at inclusivity, the need to sort of look at social, spatial justice, to look at not just environmental sustainability, but also possibly ways of ensuring there is political sustainability, and of course, enhancing participatory forms of democracy in our urban areas. So those are the kinds of things that we sort of moved with, and I think in my long journey from being a sociology student to studying urban planning, and then doing my PhD in urban planning, and all of this research that we've been doing at TIS for the last 10 years or so, it has given me a very interesting sort of vantage point to understand different kinds and the different trajectories of Indian urbanization, and particularly how social structures interact with the spatiality of cities, right? And how space in cities, both the lived environment, how we live in the cities, as well as the built environment, which includes all your buildings, your infrastructure, water, sanitation, roads, etc., how does that get produced, right? And so I think one of the primary things that sociology helps to do is, give this kind of an approach, which is to say that, no space is just there. It doesn't exist up front. Space is actually produced. And there is a politics to the way in which it is produced and who is producing it. And I think once you start sort of engaging in that kind of a lens of understanding how spaces get produced, you try and understand, what this means for different groups of people in our cities, right? The different sort of institutions in our cities and what they do in terms of, sort of making our cities in different ways. And of course, how planning then fits into all of this. So today I'm going to just bring up two broad points that I wanted to sort of lay out there. And these would be basically to say that, to understand that the spatial interventions that we do, meaning the kind of planning that we do, the urban strategies, the urban design, the urban plans that we come up with, the smaller zoning devices that we have, the land use plans that we have. These are all different kinds of spatial interventions, or even when we put in particular infrastructures, right? These are spatial interventions, these are material interventions, right? But they impact the way the social world is structured. Okay, that's my first point. And the second point that I'm going to be highlighting through my lecture is to understand that the way in which our social world is already structured impacts how spatial decisions are being made and also how the outcomes of planning can change from the intentions that we have of planning. Okay, so 2 points. The first point being that planning affects the way we live, the way we interact as social beings. And the second point is the fact that we are, in a society that there are, class divisions, there are gender hierarchies, there is gender inequality, there's possibly racial, ethnic kinds of differences. All of these go to show that, these can impact how decisions about city making is going to turn out, or who is going to actually going to be making these decisions about the kind of plans, the kind of planning our cities need. And that will in turn affect the kind of outcomes on the ground. Okay. So these are sort of my key points, and I'm going to be bringing up my presentation so that you can see this. Okay, is this visible to all?
Yes, 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 visible. Yeah.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes.
So what I'm going to be doing is speaking very broadly about the kind of socioeconomic challenges there are to spatial planning. And just as I've outlined, there are these 2 points that I'm trying to make, that spatial interventions impact the way the social world is structured, and the way our social world is structured in turn influences our spatial decisions. And here I'd like to sort of point out, one of uh, the people that I really sort of admire, whose work sort of admire. She wasn't a planner in the strictest terms, but she had a deep influence in the way the city of New York was planned, and in the way we sort of engaged with American cities and understood planning as being a very powerful instrument that had real impact on people's lives. So Jane Jacobs says that there is no logic that can be superimposed on the city. People make it. And it is to them, not buildings, that we must fit our plans. So Jane Jacobs quite importantly focuses on the fact that it's people who make cities, and not necessarily the built form, the existing buildings, the roads, etc. And it's very hard to sort of impose a particular kind of logic onto existing cities, onto people's lives, because it's not going to work that way. uh, but in turn, what she suggests is that we have to fit plans around the fact that there are different people, different groups in our cities with different kind of needs, with different kind of demands, with different kind of vulnerabilities, and different kinds of aspirations from the cities that they live in. And therefore, our planning has to reflect some of this. And this can be the tricky part. This is where planning gets both interesting, but it also gets enormously messy, because what we're dealing with is very different sets of demands. Sometimes they're contesting kinds of aspirations. Somebody might want roads, the others might want, more open spaces. Some people need more housing, some people need, access to public spaces. How do you sort of then negotiate? How do you sort of balance these needs, etc.? And the fact that we can't do it from a top-down manner is what she's trying to highlight there. That we must take into consideration what people are saying and what people are thinking and what people actually need from the ground up. And how do we do that? I think that's been kind of the challenge over that's kind of been the challenge of planning ever since planning became a sort of discipline in the strictest sense. So I just like to sort of brush up, what is spatial planning and why do we do it, right? So before, don't look at the screen. I just want to hear from you what you think, why do we do spatial planning?
Yeah, some of you can interact.
Yes?
Yeah, please.
Why do we do urban planning?
To make a best use of the space, ma'am.
Okay. Yes. Anybody more?
To systemize and bring order.
Okay. Great. Somebody else?
To meet the demands of all the groups of people, maybe low income, middle, and high, to bring
Okay.
equality.
Okay. And can you sort of specify what kind of demands?
Maybe some may have the housing in a good attempt, but the poor people, they are not even allocated lands or housing part, they are missing. So in that way,
Okay. Okay. Anything else anybody would like to add?
To prevent excessive development.
Okay. And what do you mean by that? And why is it harmful?
Just in a neighborhood, for example, like if it is like required only one shop, a commercial space, like too much of development, like too much of commercial space dumping in one particular area, I think that will be an excessive development. Like one is required, but more than one is excessive. Yeah.
Okay. So I think all of you are right in some sense. The the real sort of need behind spatial planning, what we do, is that we are trying to sort of guide a kind of a balanced form of development in our cities, so that there is no unevenness, so that we're able to sort of distribute scarce resources and amenities in an equitable manner, so that everybody has access to this, right? What spatial planning also tries to do, because it deals with land and the material realities of our cities, it tries to also encourage sustainable development. So it's not just thinking for now, but it's also predicting long term into the future. So most of your master plans or development plans are, have a very long horizon of 20, 25 years. We also have short-term plans, which are, say, possibly annual plans or five-year plans, or we do revisions every 10 years to our master plans, or supposedly we're supposed to do. revisions to our master plans. So what this sort of does is, to sort of encourage sustainable development, that we're not just developing, or we're just not thinking of the here and now, but we are also thinking into the future, and we are ensuring that there is enough sort of balanced kind of distribution of resources, and that we are taking care of uh, the sort of the richest kind of resources that we have in our cities, which is possibly the water, the greens, the open spaces, to sort of ensure that there's no sort of to sort of also maybe address climate change. And so spatial planning sort of tries and addresses all these different goals. Another thing that spatial planning does is, or tries to do, is to promote or direct economic growth. And I think, all of you are probably very familiar with the term cities as engines of economic growth, right? And especially since the 1991, since liberalization, privatization, and globalization, what we have is, there's this uh, sort of need to sort of look at cities as, as spaces of investment, right? And how we try and bring through this investment, we're trying to bring about more and more economic growth. And as economists will tell you that, most of the GDP of our country comes from these kind of really large urban settlements, right? So the share of the GDP from urban spaces. So in that sense, cities are both, are very strategic spaces for economic development. And therefore, spatial planning, because it has the power to sort of direct, the kind of land use, it has the power to sort of direct resources into a particular place. It has the power to sort of develop infrastructure in particular places, to sort of decide on densities in particular areas. By doing this, spatial planning can promote or direct economic growth in cities. Of course, there is also another different dimension to spatial planning, which is enabling access to social amenities, and this is probably the sort of social justice angle of urban planning. And the fact that, like you said, there are poorer people, there are probably vulnerable groups, there are groups with different kinds of needs, etc. And therefore, to enable access to important social amenities, which have a deep impact on how we sort of look at development overall, that's kind of important, right? So your social amenities would be, access to health infrastructure, hospitals, primary health centers. It would be access to, say, police stations, to schools, to all these kinds of social amenities, and to ensure that they are distributed across space and they're not concentrated in particular areas only. And that's kind of a very, very important role that spatial planning can play, right? Um, and the, and I would say one of the other kind of sort of goals, I think, in the past 2 years, which has become very, very clear to us, it is one of the prime reasons why sort of we saw urban planning emerge, and that is ensuring public health and hygiene. And this was one of the primary reasons why you had, planning codes evolve in, say, London, post the plague, etc., and post these kind of public health crisis. And what they realized was that, we needed stricter building codes, we needed stricter town planning norms, we needed to sort of standardize certain things in order to ensure public health and hygiene. And these were kind of colonial constructs at that point of time, but they found their way into our planning framework, the planning regulations and legalities that you have even today. And the last 2 years, when you've seen sort of COVID becoming sort of one of the sort of key forces that has kind of pushed everyone across the globe to sort of deal with it in very different ways, right from the globalized north to heavily urbanized cities in China, to even our densely populated cities in Bombay or Delhi, right? So the kind of issues that we're dealing with, and COVID kind of in the initial phase was very much of an urban phenomena, and people were sort of thinking about the densities, the built form, etc., access to water, and all of these issues, urban poverty, and how these would interact, and how these could sort of produce different kind of outcomes or different kind of contagions in these kind of different cities, right? So I think spatial planning, because it can control densities, it can control built form, it can sort of shape where people will live in the future. It can sort of direct growth nodes, etc. And how many people to what kind of space, and what kind of spaces will remain open spaces. How will our green spaces be developed and intertwined with our lived environment? All of these decisions are happening through spatial planning, right? It's a different matter that master plans and development plans don't actually get implemented that the way they are conceived of. But the fact is that it is an important way of thinking about our cities, right? And ensuring that certain things get distributed, certain amenities get distributed widely across the cities, and that there is no concentration of particular kinds of resources in particular areas. How are we doing so far? Is this clear to all?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes,
Okay,
ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
Yes, ma'am.
great. So I'll start uh, sharing. Just a minute. Okay. So what you have is, these are kind of the basic reasons why we do spatial planning, right? And so there is a bit of the social, there's a bit of the economic, uh, there's a bit of the political that's sort of intertwined in the goals of spatial planning and why we do it, right? As well as the health dimension, which is so important right now, right? So I'm going to be running through a couple of case studies, especially three case studies, sort of brings out, uh, what are we sort of encountering when we do spatial planning, the kinds of problems, the kinds of socio-economic challenges that spatial planning encounters. Not just encounters, but I would argue that spatial planning actually sometimes produces certain forms of socioeconomic problems. It can also maintain certain sorts of socioeconomic problems, which are, the kind of economic inequalities or socioeconomic inequalities that are there, the kinds of social exclusion that are there, the kinds of marginalizations that are there of certain sections of the population in our cities. So what I'm kind of trying to be doing is, showing you how, even though spatial planning has these really broad, interesting, and sort of noble kind of intentions, we don't necessarily always are able to sort of manifest those intentions, right? And so instead of sort of redistributing or sort of distributing social amenities, we might land up actually, concentrating wealth or concentrating even poverty. And that produces, or that kind of can sort of maintain forms of exclusion and inequality and marginalization in our cities, and which is problematic. Okay, so there are three examples that I'm going to sort of run through. There are different scales, different sort of scales in terms of whether it's the city, the neighborhood, or even at the building or the street level, and they're also at different times or temporalities, right? So the first one that I'm going to be bringing up is about colonial planning practices and the question of racial segregation. in the name of public health and hygiene. And the second one is looking at modernist forms of urban planning and gender exclusion in the name of zoning. And the third one that I'm going to be looking at is the more sort of liberalized urban planning that we have today and the kinds of socioeconomic marginalization that happens in the name of city renewal. So the first one is colonial planning and racial segregation. This year is a plan of, colonial Calcutta. All of you possibly know that Calcutta was, the capital of, the British colonial rulers. Um, and beyond, so one of the things that is said about the production of cities by the colonial rulers is that colonial rulers produced these cities in order to sort of build their ports or build infrastructure, etc., through which they could extract the wealth from these from our country, right? So they needed these ports, they needed these cities where they could sort of process, you know, the cotton, process the spices, etc., before they sort of dispatch them over the seas. So, in a way, cities became sort of the grounds for or the major sites for this kind of accumulation of colonial power and colonial wealth. And these were therefore very, very important sort of nodes in the entire sort of colonial map of extraction. Okay. And what happened is, but even in the cities that they did create, that they did produce, from the erstwhile villages. So Calcutta was, a group of villages, right? And they sort of brought it together. They put down infrastructure. They built retaining walls and etc. They built the port. Uh, and they used the river to sort of channelize the flow of goods, etc. And they set up their administrative sort of offices, etc. What they also did through this practice was they created a differentiated city. They created an unequal city, right? And what they did is they created the black town and they created the white town. The white town was essentially where colonial rulers lived, and black town was where the natives would live. And even in Delhi, you can find traces of this similar patterns of this kind of colonial construction of cities. You'd find this in Bombay as well as in Madras. These are essentially your four sort of colonial cities. What you also find is that there is a demarcation that was made between the black town and the white town. And why I use black and white is also, it gives you a sense of how colonial planning at its heart was extremely racial, right? And it tended to sort of keep different population groups according to races apart, right? And one of the devices that it used to do this was, drawing of the cordon sanitaire, which actually meant the line of sanitation. So it was almost as if the White Town was the area where they would come up with, you know, the sanitation devices, the sanitation infrastructure. The Black Town, where you'd find the sort of open defecation, and there would be no sort of drains, etc. At best, an open drain or two, right? But it was in the White Town where they sort of came up with the colonial systems of infrastructure planning, which is separating water from wastewater from good water as well. And this is something that they learned in colonial London, right? And this is something that they learned especially after the plague sort of hit London, and London was a manufacturing base for them, right? And they had these areas where they had their own sort of slum settlements or settlements for their workers, where there was a very, very poor, so there was a dense, congested kind of settlement pattern. And what you had, in the late sort of 1800s, there was the plague that happened because of rats in the sewer system. But there was also, an outbreak of a major outbreak of cholera because people were drinking water which was mixed with wastewater simply because the sanitation sort of was not in place. The sanitation infrastructure was not in place properly. Before that, people thought, cholera or the disease that they sort of had was, something that was caused by miasma or something that was in the air, right? But it took somebody who did this kind of planning and plotting to understand how poorer neighborhoods with denser populations were dependent on these water pipes or water posts in London, and this is where the wastewater was getting contaminated. Sorry, the drinking water was getting contaminated with the wastewater, and so they devised these ways to sort of create drains, to create sort of ways to sort of carry out the wastewater from buildings and to channelize them and to sort of make them flow into the river through different channels from the drinking water supply, right? So the separation of the drinking water, etc., and the creation of a separate sanitation sort of zone. And here, what you have is so effectively what you saw being produced in Calcutta as well was a reproduction of this idea of how do you improve or how do you sort of put in a sort of sanitation infrastructure in these kind of colonial cities. So in colonial Calcutta, a part of the city, the heart of the city was where the white people, the rulers, the colonial rulers would actually live, and they did not want to mingle with the natives. And this part of the city was where you had the roads laid out according to a particular grid fashion. You had the infrastructure according to a grid fashion. You had slums being raised from this particular area. So what you have is, so the larger goal was health and hygiene, but what it kind of erased or what it kind of didn't say was that it was also a tool to sort of keep uh, the two races separate and not let them intermingle. So these were areas. The White Town was an area where natives had a lower status than the whites, right? And they usually came to work there, but they couldn't find living spaces there. They were not welcome to live there, right? Except for, of course, a few elites who managed to live in the peripheries of the White Town. So that was colonial practices, right? And here I'm going to be, this is a picture of American suburbia of the 1950s, late 1940s, early 1950s. And this is, maybe some of you have heard of it, but it's called Levittown. And this was a suburban sort of area, sort of post-Fordist economy, where automobiles were being manufactured at a great pace in post-war America, sort of that led to the economic boom in America, right? So automobiles were fundamental to the way Americans imagined not just their independence, their freedom, but also economic growth and individual prosperity, right? And at the same time, what you had is that the dream or the aspiration that was being peddled at that point of time by the American government, and which was also sort of related to post-war reconstruction in America, was that you could own your own home, right? But it had to be in the suburbs where land was cheaper, and basically your own home uh, would be this really nice structure. You'd have this nuclear family, and you'd have lots of space around your home, and that each family would have its own home, large spacious homes, And basically, you would have to commute via automobiles back to the city to work, right? Now, this is great. I mean, this means that you'd have to create all these new homes, which would lead to post-war reconstruction efforts. It would lead to urbanization. I'm not sure, but if you're familiar with the artist Rembrandt, have you heard of him? Anybody?
Yes, ma'am.
Yes. So, this is kind of sort of reinstating what Frank Lloyd Wright dreamed of in his conception of broadacre cities, right? The sort of suburban dream of, every family owning almost an acre of land, and all of this land would be urbanized. Each would be, a home with a little bit of land, and then and these suburban areas would be interconnected, and they would be also connected to the cities which would be the workspaces, and that you'd have these massive highways connecting the suburbs to the cities. So what it meant was construction of new housing. It meant rapid urbanization. It also meant construction of highways, and it meant a dependence on automobiles and people buying more and more automobiles, right? So you'd have to manufacture more and more automobiles. So see, this is a beautiful dream because it completely captures, the American sort of motive of economic development along with urbanization. And this is fueled by the automobile. This is fueled by the imagination of the suburban home. What it doesn't sort of tell you is the kind of gender inequality that it reproduces, maintains, and perpetuates, right? In this imagination, and if you see there are these really interesting advertisements dating back from the 50s and 60s, American advertisements, where you'll find these kind of really cute houses with
Hello, ma'am.
white. Yes, yes,
Ma'am, the slides are not changing probably.
yes. Okay, just a minute. Okay, just a minute. I've stopped sharing. Okay, yeah. Okay, so I'll just speak because I think there's something wrong with the slide. I'm just going to speak and I'm going to leave this particular slide. So the slide where I was trying to talk about the modernist planning is also about gender exclusion, meaning that, the imagination there is about the man going to work and the woman staying at home to take care of the kids, to take them to school, uh, you know, uh, and basically, run the house. So the separation of work and home was kind of deeply embedded in the planning imagination. Not just the separation of work and home, it also meant a gender separation of who would be home and who would be at work. So it was the man who was commuting to and fro from the suburbia to the city and back, but the woman would be the person who would be living at home. So, these kind of spaces became extremely gendered. It became a way to sort of say, it became a sort of a challenge to sort of women to join the workforce, right? Because this American dream of the suburbia did not kind of really accommodate women's aspiration to work, right? It was almost like you would live in this kind of housing, and your best use would be to actually have a family and bring up the family, right? So that is another way in which you did have planning, right? And you did sort of look at economic development. You looked at urbanization, and you sort of uh, did that in a fast-paced manner. All these kind of new towns and new suburbias popped up. But what you didn't sort of imagine is that you would be actually drawing in space these different kind of exclusions, gendered exclusions. and that women would feel increasingly unequal in the terms that they had to live their lives, and the fact that they couldn't join the workforce because there was an enormous actual spatial distance between home and work, right? um, so the next example that I'm going to be looking at uh, is kind of more contemporary. Just a minute. Okay, so this example is from the mill lands in Mumbai, and some of you may be familiar. I don't know if you've ever been to Bombay, or some of you live in Maharashtra and are therefore familiar with Bombay. But in the 1990s, what you had is a great push to sort of rethink uh, the city and sort of go for a large sort of urban renewal practice, a large kind of spatial reconstruction of the city. And this was kind of uh, triggered by the fact that uh, the economy of the city had changed to a large extent. uh, Bombay was a textile city, and so Bombay had these large textile mills and a great deal of people working as mill workers in these mills. So, large proportion of the city's land was actually taken up by these mills. But post 1991, post liberalization, privatization, and globalization, these mills began to shut down one after another, right? A lot of these mills were shifted to the peripheries of the city because they were considered as polluting, right? And some of these mills just shut down and they were just sitting there because it was no longer the owners of the mills found it difficult to sort of operate these mills with these numbers of workers because, there were cheaper modes of sort of production that was taking place elsewhere, right? Uh, so, and different technologies that were coming up, and so instead of doing anything about these, to sort of improve the mills, to keep the mills working, they simply either moved the mills to the periphery, or they just simply sat on it. The owners simply sat on it or sort of shut down the mills. There was also a lot of resistance by mill workers themselves as they forced faced this kind of forced lockout, and they lost their jobs, their means of livelihoods. And so in 1991, where you also have Bombay coming up, um, and the beginnings of Bombay as a sort of a financial city, a city where financial transactions are going to happen, and there is an inflow of foreign investment coming into the city. Um, so these particular lands become strategically very important for the city's future. And so a decision was taken where it was sort of the government sort of stepped in and said, well, what we could do is we could sort of redevelop the mill lands, and sort of, give back one third to, you know, back to the owners uh, for redevelopment into other kinds of, high-end housing or commercial development. One third could be for affordable housing, and another one third could be public amenities that comes back to the city, right? Instead of just letting vacant mill land stay, right? So, this was kind of what was being debated at that time, and there was this enormous kind of debate. Various kind of stakeholders got involved in this kind of debate. A lot of, they tried to look at what the Bombay Development Plan was going to say, what were the development plan regulations saying about this. How much could they develop, what kind of densities were going to be approved, etc. what you had is eventually out of all of this was that most of these mill lands were converted. They were sort of reconstituted, and they became extremely high-end housing, uh, tall skyscrapers. They became malls. So you have the Phoenix Mill malls there, the famous one. And you had a host of other kinds of commercial development coming up on the erstwhile mill lands, right? So all of this mill land gets converted. But what happens to the people who were actually living there, the workers who were living there? And they had to sort of move out of this place. So was the one third, one third, one third solution worked out? Unfortunately, no. There was a huge committee that was set up. I think Charles Correa was part of that committee, and there was the HDFC chairman who was also part of that committee at one point of time. Various deliberations took place. The city government, the Mumbai Municipal Corporation, wanted back part of the land so it could develop amenities. But what happened at the end was a tweaking of the development regulations, which meant that the housing was not you were not going to develop affordable housing in those areas. Um, uh, Only a small percentage was actually going to be developed as affordable housing. Most of the other sort of housing was going to be developed on the peripheries. But it took a lot of organizing by the mill workers, a lot of mobilization by the mill workers to get the government to sort of go back, sort of rethink this. And it's only after a lot of, counter struggle, a lot of debates that, finally some of the housing is actually being rebuilt in the middle of the city. But what you have is here, in the name of redevelopment of the mill lands, what you had is a very effective strategy of moving poorer mill workers outside, or moving them away from the city center and onto the periphery of the city, right? But saying that we are doing this to redevelop the mill lands because they're vacant and they're not underused, they're not being used properly. But yes, the mills were not being used, but there was also a lot of workers' housing around, in and around those mill lands, which had come up because there was at a time when the mills came up, the mill owners had provided workers' housing in around those mill lands, right? So they would have to commute less. So, in effect, by the strategy of trying to renew or reconstruct the city, what you had is, the making of a world-class city of Mumbai, and sort of taking over this kind of very strategic piece of land in the middle of the city to sort of build this kind of new sort of commercial high-end development, which had no place for the urban poor or no place for the mill workers, right? So, in effect, it became a way of sort of building new or bringing in new forms of urban socio-economic inequalities, right? Any questions? Any sort of observations that you would like to sort of point out from these three cases? Like, what comes to your mind when you hear about these three cases, three different points of time? If you were to sort of sum it up, what was planning trying to do, but what did it achieve? What did it not achieve? What really happened on the ground? What forms of, social inequalities do you see being produced or reproduced through these forms of spatial planning? Yes? Anybody? Come on, don't be shy. Which example sort of struck you and why? Anybody? Hello? Okay. Shall I move on? Yeah? Okay.
Yeah, I think it's better. They are
Okay. Right. I'll just go to the one. Okay. So basically, what you're trying to see is that, you know, through these examples, what comes to mind is the different ways in which sort of the spatial interventions impact how people will live, how they will access their resources, right? And how will they interact, right? And I think the basic questions that you need to ask is, through these spatial interventions, through these plans that we were doing, or through these spatial plans that we were making, uh, whether it's building new infrastructure, whether it's going for rezoning, whether it's kind of building new towns or suburbia, all these are different kinds of spatial strategies. And the questions, therefore, to ask is, so who benefits from these strategies and who loses from these strategies, right? In terms of like, how will they live? How will they access their resources? How will they interact in space, right? And then the following question is, of course, if how do then existing social structures impact our spatial decisions and the outcomes of planning? So we have to look at who is making these plans, right? Who is taking these decisions? Which institutions are calling the shots when it comes to planning, right? Because there are real stakes involved here, right? If you're benefiting, is it an economic benefit, right? If you're benefiting, is it because you have access to a road, right, which opens up your ability to get to a job, right? So that's a real sort of mode of development. But if you have, access to a road, but the fact is that, the way in which our transport infrastructure is built is meant for commuting patterns of men and not women, then you know that, perhaps that it is built by men and meant to benefit men, but not necessarily for women. So this goes back to a very interesting study that we did in Mumbai, for instance, looking at the suburban railway of Mumbai and really trying to look at, the patterns of how women used the railways on a day-to-day basis. Uh, from the design of the railway coach itself to the design of the station, the platform, etc., to the design of the way in which services, meaning, which train, how many trains, what frequency, what times, etc., along with station amenities, all pointed out to the fact that, the entire railway system was built to sort of, address men's needs and not women's needs, right? So very sort of telling example is the platform gap. Anyone familiar with Mumbai or who has been on the train or has commuted on the train? Mumbai rail, suburban railways. Anybody here?
Yes, ma'am.
Yeah. So what can you tell me about the platform gap? Are you aware of what is the platform gap?
Not quite, ma'am.
Okay. So, maybe you can just describe what you see the difference between women's coaches and men's coaches at peak time.
Yeah, there are very few women coaches and a lot of men coaches.
Yes. So that's one, typical sort of inequality, thinking that, there are lesser women going to work than men, right?
Yes, ma'am.
Which is why you have fewer coaches for women and men. So it's not equal, but the fact is that there are lesser, right? So that inequality is designed into that particular system.
But
Anything
ma'am,
else?
can't we say that it is like they are getting privileges of having a special coach than saying that there are lesser women going to work? Because in the common coaches, everyone travels together, but there are no special coaches for men, but there are special coaches for women.
But have you ever seen women like in those peak hour times? How many women do you see actually in those other coaches, which are not women's coaches?
Okay, okay. Yes.
So, the practice is something else, right? So, I think, and then that's a combination of social, spatial factors that come in there, design factors. So, what I was getting at is the platform gap. So while we were studying, we found out that there is this platform gap, and I'm 5 feet in height. Okay. And if I tried to get onto the train, I found myself almost slipping in between the train and the platform because it was not meant, the coach was designed at a height which was meant for a man's height, you know, definitely more than 5'6", right? And so in a rush, it's possible that if women are shorter than men, and body wise, structure wise, and that and this design was not thought of when you are thinking of how to sort of think about the design aspect of platforms. Maybe you can't change the coaches, or but there was this gap between the coach and the platform which affected women much more than men. And we also saw that more women got onto the train with children than did the men. The children traveled with the women, right? We also found that women typically carried more baggage or luggage than men because they had their dabbas, they had certain things. And in the Mumbai railways, you'll also find women who carry their vegetables because they're trying to cut vegetables in the train itself to save time, because by the time they'll reach home, their vegetables would have been chopped and they would get straight to cooking, right? So we found that, because they were carrying heavier loads, possibly, and they were also carrying children, they were also shorter than men. There was a chance that women could, fall into that the gap between the platform and the coach. Even inside the coach, we found that, where your how would you place your luggage? Those overhead racks that are there, I tried reaching for one. If I jumped a couple of times, maybe I could reach it. Seriously. But for men, it was very easy. You just reached and, it was there. So uh, things like this, things like, toilets at the stations. And we found that, there were fewer women's toilets. Men could go wherever they wanted. Women could not because of privacy issues. And most of these women's toilets were in such poor shape, infrastructure wise. Either they're broken, they were locked, or there was no water, or they were extremely dirty. And so, as a result, we found that women who were commuting on a day to day basis and traveling almost 40 minutes one way, or an hour one way, were holding on to their need to go. And this was leading to health issues amongst women who traveled daily using the train. And so, what this kind of tells you is that, even in the design thinking, even in how we design infrastructure, how we sort of look at access, how we sort of look at, even in the service of trains. So, trains, peak hours, you'd have lots of frequency of trains. But if you came to the afternoon hours, there would be lesser frequency of trains. And you would say, of course, because there are fewer people who travel off peak hours. But we found out it was mostly women who were traveling off peak hours. Not because they didn't want to face the crowd, but because they were traveling at off peak hours to do other kinds of household duties, which was basically pick up children from schools, or go to the market, etc. But there were fewer frequencies of trains that came in. So in a sense, that kind of entire transportation planning, and if you ask the question, who is actually planning this, who's making the decisions, and as a result of that, who is benefiting from these decisions, and who's losing out because of these decisions, whose demands, whose needs are not being met by these decisions. And I think you can then start to sort of analyze, then sort of pinpoint what the exclusions and inclusions are, right? And that's where it becomes very, very interesting. So, how is our social world structured? And I think Sir might have already taught you that, if you look at our society, there are social groups, there are institutions, there are structures, there are norms, there are values, and a sociological framework helps you to think through these things, right? If you take a Marxist point of view, right, you you would probably look at the cities as being divided into two different kinds of classes, the haves versus the have-nots. And then you'd sort of ask, okay, what impact or what implication does this theory have, a Marxist framework have for understanding cities, right? So if you're looking at class relations and these kind of socioeconomic inequalities between classes, say the rich, those who have access to the means of production, the wealthy, those who accumulate the wealth, versus those who don't, the poor, the workers, etc. So if you go back to that mill lands case, we can apply this kind of a Marxist framework, this kind of a theoretical lens, to understand how the people who owned the mill lands, right, the mill owners used the planning sort of technology, the planning framework to their advantage, right? And to their advantage, meaning they were able to change, tweak the planning laws in order to build these really um, sort of uh, sort of high yielding commercial complexes, right? High end buildings, high end malls, etc. These new spaces, which they sold then at sky high rates, and they made a lot of money through this kind of real estate, right? So what was essentially mill land and mill workers' housing became housing for the extremely rich. It became prime real estate, right? And what it did was it took away from those who did not have this kind of wealth at all. So the mill workers who used to live in these areas were therefore exploited, were therefore kept away and excluded and pushed to the margins of the city, pushed to the periphery of the city, saying, okay, we'll build housing for you here. But what that meant was, they lost their incomes, they lost their access to livelihoods, and you know the difference, the socio-economic difference between the haves and the have-nots simply grew wider and wider. So this kind of a Marxist imagination or a Marxist theory helps us to think about how to look at this kind of planning practice, right? So this is one way of understanding planning practice, right? Or if you even take a feminist kind of perspective, the train example that I gave you right now is something that a feminist perspective would give you, would sort of tell you, listen, this is where we're sort of this is what we're not being able to address in our planning perspective, right? We think we are being rational, we think we are being completely objective when we draw our modernist plans, but we don't see the kind of underlying sort of inequalities that we can produce or recreate or reproduce through our plans. And that is something that we need to be cognizant of. And I think this kind of sociological frames or sociological theories help us to look at plans and planning practice in a very different way, right? You also have Michel Foucault, who talks about power, and he says that basically, architecture is kind of a political technology for the government. It basically works, by controlling the built environment in a particular way through surveillance, through enclosure, through organization of individuals in space. So basically, architecture is a tool in the hands of the government, the politically powerful, and it helps to create control. It creates to create a particular sense of order. not for everyone, but for those who want that control, those who want to cling on to that sense of power, right? For the powerful, it's a means to sort of keep their status quo alive, right? But there are also other theorists that I particularly like, social theories, who someone like Michel Desartou, a French thinker, who talks about how people, operate in the city, and that the fact that you can't really control, you can't really exclude people, because people have their own ways of uh, sort of appropriating space, of making space their own, of kind of living that space in different ways, of kind of of kind of using that space in the way that they want to. And of course, so these are some of the very important ideas that kind of animate uh, a kind of a socio-spatial thinking, and not just a spatial thinking, right? They also kind of highlight what is wrong, perhaps, with spatial planning, the kind of modernist kind of spatial planning that we have today. And I think all of you may be aware of it by now, that often we say that spatial planning, or the way we do our master plans, is completely top down. It's divorced from social realities on the ground. It's too fixed. It's too rigid. Cities don't actually, land users are not actually that rigid. Things are changing day by day, almost hour by hour in our cities. What is a pawn shop during the day becomes someone's sleeping space by night. Or maybe a different kind of a dukan in the morning, right? So so these kinds of patterns of the sort of flexible use of space, the kind of rapid ways in which our cities are changing, is something that possibly planning today is trying to really grapple with. uh, Planning also tries to be very sort of rational and objective. But we see that in trying to be rational and objective, we say that we are not for anybody or any particular group, right? What planning tries to do is study everything that's there, and then tries to come up with a plan that is going to be rational, that is going to be objective, that is kind of balance different kind of interests, right? But if you'll see the actual operations of the plan, and how it's kind of how plans get uh, sort of okayed, or how, or who finally sort of says yes, the master plan is good to go, that there are different kinds of politics at play there, right? And so there is this kind of planning is something that the study of society, how social rules, social norms operate, tries to tell us about how planning itself may need a kind of a revision in thinking. Um, and increasingly we see that the state is also not just a facilitator in terms of planning, but the state itself is becoming, in certain senses in today's world, an entrepreneur and a developer, and is equally adept at sort of grabbing land, sort of dispossessing the poor, and all of these things, along with making cities a better place. So there are contradictions within planning itself, because there are so many different stakes, interest groups, stakeholder groups, private capital, poor groups, groups that are mobilizing by themselves in a city which is trying to get the best out of this plan, right? But still, spatial planning remains important. Yes, there are flaws, there are problems, but I think what we need to do is really question ourselves. How do we ensure that urban dwellers can fully participate in and benefit from urban life, right? So how do we sort of engage with urban dwellers, right? How do we understand, or how do we build communities instead of breaking them down, right? How do we sort of build a feeling of belongingness to cities, an identity for citizens, and sort of create spaces for interaction in our cities, rather than cities becoming, very anonymous kind of areas which don't allow for these kind of interactions to take place. How do we counteract these kinds of social spatial exclusion? So how do we ensure that the poor are included in our plans, whether it's materially, whether it's politically, whether it's socially, right, and economically? How do we improve the quality of life for the built and the lived environment, especially of vulnerable groups? And I think these are questions that are very, very important and helps to rethink spatial planning today. And if you've gone back to your 74th Constitutional Amendment Act, how does it view planning? And it actually says that municipalities have to come up with the preparation of plans for economic development and social justice, right? And for the implementation of development schemes as may be required to enable them to function as institutions of self-government. So along with sort of promoting local self-government at that level, right? So it's not just we need to have town plans, but what this, these kind of master plans or development plans need to also address economic development. They need to also address questions of social justice, right? And how do we do that with spatial plans, right? How do we do that through spatial interventions? Have we been able to do it? Where have we been able to do it, right? And this is where I say, why all is not lost. There seems to be certain cases where we're making certain progressive kind of decisions, progressive kind of plans, uh, certain kind of really radical plans that are coming out from different parts of the world, which show that, spatial planning can address gender exclusion, can address, say, economic marginalization, can address ecological degradation, can address racial segregation, can address political marginalization and questions of citizenship. So this is a drawing that I particularly like, and it sort of brings to you how children think about cities, right? And how school children, when they were given this exercise and what they thought, was important in our cities. What was the most important things that we needed to think about in our cities, right? So the first,
Ma'am,
yes,
the sketch is not displayed, ma'am. Are you showing the sketch?
yes, it's a sketch. Can you see it?
No, ma'am. We can just see the key point slide.
Okay, just a minute. I don't know why it's not moving.
Ma'am, you need to present the entire window, ma'am. Then slides will change.
Okay, just a minute. Okay. Okay. Can you see this?
Not yet.
Not yet?
Now it's okay.
Yeah? Okay.
Yeah.
Okay. So this is a drawing by kids, just to say, what are those most important things to them? And they came up with these very important sort of things that they wanted to say. Uh, they sort of looked at, of course, housing, but they were looking at affordable housing. They mentioned very interestingly more space for playgrounds. They wanted a safe city. They wanted care, a caring city, right? And they felt that cities didn't have that in them because there was a lack of care in the city. There was a lack of public spaces in the city. They also pointed out how there was more need for spatial equity or fairer use of land for different kinds of purposes, you know, and uh, and some of this, you find even today starting to sort of reflect in our broader sort of national policies. And if you take a look at our national urban transport policy, for example, the NUTP, which came out in 2006, it talks about, the equitable distribution of road space, and it talks about how we need to prioritize non-motorized use of road space and non-motorized transportation in road space over motorized transportation, right? And this not only does it lead to safer streets, but possibly it leads to some measure of equity as well, right? And of course, a better kind of environment, lesser pollution as well. Affordable housing, thinking about the poor in the city. So if you really think about, from the perspective of what we get right and what are those key things that people need to sort of think about when we're thinking about cities, these are some of the things that even children can come up with. And I'm sure each of you can come up with these values that you have for cities in the future and even cities right now, what they need to get right, right? So, if I were to hear from you, could you add anything to this? Anything that comes to your mind in which your ideal city should have? Anybody? What would your ideal city have in addition to public spaces, more spaces for playgrounds, safer cities, caring cities, affordable housing? What would you?
Walkability, ma'am. Like,
Okay, walkability, great. Anything else?
and resilience also. Like resilient cities will be.
Okay, how would you define that? Some characteristics?
Uh, the self-sufficient coefficient. If we can use a proper use of resources, and we have to have a self-sufficient economic generation
Okay,
in that aspect.
okay. So resilience against,
Ma'am,
different kinds of risks. Yes, go ahead.
ma'am, sustainability. For example, having a permeable concrete so that floods doesn't occur too often. Um, maybe some floods are not an natural disaster. We are making few disasters because of the unplanned uh, development or construction that is going on.
Mm-hmm.
So it has to be planned in a sustainable way so that we give preference to our environment as well.
Okay, okay. Very interesting that you pointed this out because I think, although we say that, planning takes care of certain environmental concerns, with climate change, there's very, very, you know, uh, very rare that, our master plans or development plans carry specific uh, sort of, um, sort of, sort of dimensions of thinking about sustainability in that sense, right? It's only now that we're sort of building that into our planning. Uh, and I think the Delhi Master Plan also is trying to look at more walkability, more transit oriented development, things that sort of will improve the integration between land use and transportation, right? To sort of do that, how do we do that? To sort of come up with new kind of ways to sort of address some of those challenges. Anybody else would like to add to this?
And ma'am, recently we also heard about healthy cities, like the concepts of healthy cities.
Right, right. Um, Healthy cities in the West, they're kind of sort of looking at experimenting with 15-minute cities, and say healthy cities. So the entire sort of concern with let's make our city smart, etc. And suddenly when COVID came, we realized what are we really doing? Our cities, far from being smart, are not even healthy. you know and probably we need to sort of relook at that health aspect, which is much more important than anything else. So going back even to those colonial times when in London we found how those colonial practices gave rise to sanitation facilities, etc., building bylaws, building codes, etc. So this was to ensure that buildings had proper fire escapes, Buildings had access to light and ventilation. Building codes came up because of that, right? Because cities were getting congested. There was slum-like housing coming up in colonial cities. So, in order to promote the health and hygiene dimension, they were thinking about building codes. But so these are things that we need to sort of go back to and sort of look at what is it that we really, really want from our cities? What is really, how do we sort of prioritize this, right? How do we prioritize, say health and safety? Whose health, whose safety are we looking at? What kind of resilience are we looking at? Is it economic? Is it, environmental? Do those goals actually go together, or do those goals kind of contradict one another, right? And what do we do when we know those goals contradict one another? How do we sort of deal with those kind of contradictions? So I think, in that sense, we have. Do you see the next slide?
Yes,
Yes,
ma'am.
ma'am.
Yes.
Yes,
Yeah,
ma'am.
yeah. So if you see the next slide, it is from the sort of Maybe Delhi campaign, which is the people's campaign currently in process in Delhi, where the Delhi Master Plan has been sort of is being discussed for 2041, I think, 2021 to 2041. Uh, and this is a group of NGOs, civil society organizations, activists, and people sort of groups, housing societies, etc., that have come together to sort of put down their own demands, put down their own needs on paper so that they get reflected in that development plan, in that master plan. And this is something new in the entire planning process, because it kind of tells you that, it's not, planning is not just happening in the great DDA building in isolation from the rest of the city. It's not just being done by planners who are sitting with their data sets, but that there is pushback from citizens because they're afraid that they might be left out by the plan, which has happened in the previous plans, right? So some of the demands that the citizens groups, the NGOs, the people's groups that are coming up with, is that they're sort of cognizant that they want more access to public spaces, and public spaces then becomes a tool to fight this kind of privatization that's happening in our cities, privatization of different services, privatization of different infrastructures, privatization of even spaces, right? Where public space becomes more and more privatized, right? Where open space becomes more and more privatized. So what they're saying is, there is the livelihood aspect that Delhi master plans need to sort of, or master planners need to think about, is that livelihood, 80% of Delhi's population is part of the informal economy, which is vendors, waste pickers, that actually operates in public spaces, particularly your roads, right? So how do we plan for them? Does our master plan really think about these kind of livelihoods, right? How is it going to address livelihoods? So if you say very rigidly that the roads are meant only for the movement of vehicles, right? And if you sort of put in very strict kind of vending versus no vending zones, you probably might uh, sort of do disservice, or you might dispossess someone of their livelihoods, right? So how do we sort of engage as planners with the fact, with the real fact on the ground, that 80% of Delhi's population is part of an informal economy, right? So how do we sort of design our public spaces? What kinds of rules and regulations and frameworks do we put in place in our public places, right? In public spaces. The second point that they've pointed out to is the concept of wellness or health, right? Designing green, walkable, well-lit, unpolluted public spaces can positively impact social and environmental health in a city. Some of you actually mentioned this just a while ago. And why is it so important, right? Uh, you know, so the fact that this kind of design, why is it that we have to put it again and again and make a constant claim to this kind of a need, right? Because you will find that more and more, if you look at some of our plans and what they've been able to sort of achieve on the ground, you'll find that actually our open spaces are getting reduced, right? Whether it's Bombay, whether it's Calcutta, or whether it's Delhi, we're not able to actually protect our open spaces, right? Even if we have the plans in place because of what happens in practice on the ground, right? So, designing green, walkable, well lit, unpolluted public spaces can positively impact social and environmental health in a city. And I think, I felt it so much when COVID struck, and I could see that there were people who had access to some of the smaller towns where they people had access to open spaces near their houses. There were these, and they could still go out for a walk, wearing masks, etc. They felt better because they were able to sort of go out into the open. But in a place like Bombay, imagine, congested, where rarely people have even balconies, let alone access to terraces, etc. Uh, they just didn't have that, and they felt cooped up constantly during the lockdown phase, and that has deep psychological impacts as well. So imagine, this lack of access to walkable, well-lit green spaces, open spaces, and what does it do to our psychology, to our well-being, to our overall health? Of course, then the two more important ones are housing and transport, and how public spaces interact with both. Um, and within the housing, what these groups have been demanding is that, when you design affordable housing, uh, could it be possible to think about community space design within housing complexes? This is so important, right? Shared spaces, spaces where people come out and have, a chai or gupshup or social interaction, right? Where you can come out and talk to one another, where you can come out and sort of, just ask, how was your day, right? Uh, and so these kind of spaces are so important instead of just concentrating on the built form of the housing itself, right? But what are those common spaces within these sort of building complexes, right? It's so important to sort of think of those spaces as public spaces, as shared spaces. Whether it's also possible to think of adaptively of using public spaces to provide shelter for the homeless, or even, I would argue to think about these spaces to provide spaces for, say, vending, right? And I think COVID sort of pointed out that, some of these public spaces do need to be sort of repurposed during sort of these kind of moments of crisis, when you need to sort of house, these kind of, when you needed to house these migrants. A lot of these, public buildings such as schools, stadiums, etc., were actually repurposed into housing of migrants. They were in no way they were sort of ready to do this, but they did it. But it got planners to think a little bit more about, is a stadium just a stadium? Is a school just a school building? And what other kinds of uses can be thought of? And we already have this. We do sort of think about spaces flexibly. I think as Indians, we are sort of really sort of good at jugaad, and sort of we make the maximum use of the little bit of space that we have in our cities. With respect to transport, again, public space, particularly roads, well designed streets, pavements, bus stops, metro station facilities, transit mobility within the city. And I think this is more important, particularly for the urban poor, who are getting sort of moved away from the city center to and getting pushed onto the periphery of our cities, right? And as a result, are losing their access to livelihoods, and therefore sort of becoming poorer in that sense, becoming more vulnerable in that sense. So, how do we sort of think about transportation? How do we kind of think about transport equity? How do we sort of think about different genders and their needs of, uh, transportation and access to public spaces? Of course, disability is another concern as an emerging concern. It's not kind of mainstream as yet, but it's definitely something that's kind of coming up onto the table more and more. And of course, gender as a big construct in the design for the safety and comfort of different kinds of gender groups. And especially because of the violence that women face uh, in public space. And I think all of you are sort of familiar with the Nirbhaya case, which in Delhi, which in 2012 or 2013, I forget, which kind of got us to think about transportation, which kind of got us to think about public transportation, women's mobility, safer cities in a much more sort of critical fashion. And we started to think about it in these different lenses. What have other cities done? And I think so the picture to the left is from Medellin, a city in Colombo, which is known for drug trafficking, which is known for violence, extreme forms of gang violence, drug violence, extreme forms of poverty, uh, deep, deep forms of, inequality, socioeconomic inequality. So the rich basically lived in the center of the city, and the poor used to live in these shacks along the hillsides, which was on the periphery of the city. And this kind of this was not just a social kind of inequality; it was also a spatial kind of inequality. And one of the things that this that a very interesting sort of public planning intervention sort of brought in and changed the dynamics of the city was actually public transportation. And what you see here on the left is actually these cable cars, which became these cheaper sort of modes of transport that brought in people from the hillside to the city center, right? Where better kinds of jobs, better kinds of schooling, better kinds of or improved kinds of access to education, jobs, etc., were located. And so the poor people could come from the hills and access these jobs at a and they weren't really spending that much because this was part of the public transport network. This was also sort of supplemented by, bus rapid transit corridors and other kinds of transport interventions, and also interventions in the slum settlements, which upgraded these settlements with better infrastructure in these settlements. So what you have is, a particular kind of innovation in public transport, but it brings about a world of change. And what happens in Medellin today is that it's no longer seen as this really dangerous, drug infested, violence ridden city, but that there is some measure of control and order that's kind of come about through this kind of particular intervention, which was developed along with the people's ideas that that they needed better access to better livelihoods in order to support better lives, right? And they needed this connectivity and access to the city center because they felt they were cut off from the city center, and which is why the youth were engaging in these kinds of violent activities and drugs, etc. But so you can see that these kind of thinking. So some things that we are getting right in terms of doing planning in a very different way, right? The diagram that you see on the right is the superblocks model from Barcelona, which is kind of rethinking, and it's come up from these um, feminist planners who think that their city is unsafe, their city is inaccessible, their city is unsafe not just for women but for children, because of the kind of way in which traffic moves, and the fact that a lot of these spaces remain inaccessible for women and children as well as the elderly. So what they've done is they have sort of uh, moved the current model, they've changed the current model of the street grids, right? Where there was through traffic or vehicular through traffic to pedestrianize and open it up to sort of restricted movements of vehicular traffic, and to sort of pedestrianize these kind of areas, these residential blocks, these large residential blocks. And what it has done is, it's a very interesting model. It's come from inputs from women, from the elderly, and from children. And what they're seeing is that their streets have become much more livelier. There are more people on the street walking, cycling, simply sitting in those streets because it's less polluted. There's less busy traffic. It's no longer unsafe. Children have more place to play, so they're basically using those erstwhile through streets for playing, right? They've kind of repurposed those streets for playing, for more active kind of uses, rather than being passive sort of users who were thrown off from the grid, right? So they've kind of come back into the block. They're kind of coming out of their houses and using these spaces in very, very different ways. And because there are more people, as Jane Jacob would see, there are more eyes on the street, which means that there's more safer, there's a feeling of more safety on those streets. There's a sense of community that's being built on these streets because people are coming out, they're interacting in these shared spaces, right? Um, Again, this is a sort of a pictorial thinking about what we could do with our planning, is to sort of also repurpose these dead zones in our cities, right? So think about underpasses, underneath these highways, underneath these infrastructure corridors, which become almost dead, empty spaces, these no-go zones. And I can see this is currently happening in Mumbai, for example. There are places where citizens groups have just taken over some of these spaces, and they've just built walking tracks. They've got the local politician to put in these kind of plantation. Uh, there are some of these spaces are being used at night for and in the evenings as schools for homeless children, just street children who need a place to study in quiet. So this has also become a space for that. So there are multiple ways in which even dead zones are being repurposed. But this shows how people can be sort of pushing this kind of repurposing of spaces. So it doesn't necessarily have to come from the planners, but it can come from people and their ideas and how they actually want to reuse that space, right? There's a very famous case in South Korea where a highway was kind of pulled apart, and there was a canal that was a river, the canal that was flowing through underneath it, and that was kind of uh, recharged, and it was made into this really beautiful shared space where people could walk, etc., could feel a sense of community, could feel a sense of belongingness in that city. It also brought down apparently temperatures in that particular microclimate of that city area, where no longer this high speed traffic was no longer allowed because the entire kind of highway was lifted up and the canal was rejuvenated. So in that sense, there are things that we think that is set in stone that we can't change, but there are ways in which we can think in different ways about what do people really need, what is kind of a priority for people in living in cities, right? And one way of doing this is thinking about how to think about our public spaces, our shared spaces, and to bring in this kind of thing. So thinking about planning differently, what are the concepts that we can use? There's a famous architect from Copenhagen called Jan Gehl, who talks about cities for people. And, he talks about the human scale that we need to look at. And he says, first you need to understand how life is lived, right? How do people interact? Then you look at the spaces in which these social interactions are taking place. And then you look at the buildings. The other way around never works. So, for an architect to start from not space, but actually look at how human life is lived, this is kind of quite interesting, right? And it starts from this idea that cities are for people. People are the ones making cities. It's not the buildings, right? It's not these spaces, but it's people producing spaces through their interactions, through their aspirations, through the way they move in the city, through the way they work in the city, through the way they live in the city, right? Through the way they access different resources in the city. And so we really need to think about it from this kind of human scale, is what Jan Gale says. So that's an idea that you can probably take forward for those of you who are looking at urban design principles in thinking about cities differently. Then there is David Harvey, which is an entirely different kind of thinking, which is, he's a Marxist geographer who talks about the right to the city. This is kind of a more political approach to the city, who says that, the right to the city is far more than my individual right or liberty to access urban resources. In fact, it's something more collective. It is a right to change ourselves by changing the way our cities work, the way our cities are produced, and who's producing the city, how is the city being produced, who is the city for, and to look at things such as equitable distribution of resources, to look at social inclusion, to look at public spaces as assets, to constantly sort of fight against commodification of spaces, to fight against privatization of spaces, right? And look at where citizens have a right to be in the city. Now, if you look at Brazil, Brazil has taken this to an entirely different level. And Brazil has this right to the city charter. It's actually something in their constitution. And what they're trying to do using this is their municipalities are trying to sort of give a particular spatial dimension to the right to the city, and ensure that there is a more equitable distribution of resources in their cities. One of the ways in which they do this by engaging people in the participation and ensure there is participation by all groups in the city, a political participation by all groups in the city, is something which they call participatory budgeting, right? Which is from the neighborhood itself, the neighborhood level itself, they start actually looking at and prioritizing what kinds of projects or what kind of infrastructures is a priority at that neighborhood level, how much is going to be required to build those kinds of spaces, infrastructure, etc. And then all these gets aggregated, this gets discussed, debated, and then a kind of public plan comes out, a public budget comes out, which reflects each of these neighborhoods' priorities, right? So this is something that they do, and this is something that even I know for a fact that Pimpri Chinchwad near Pune city is also trying to do, is trying to build in these kinds of participatory modes of budgeting by having the ward committees or ward level consultation around what are, what is your priority, right, in terms of the kind of city that you want. So, what must we do to foster socioeconomic development, inclusion, cohesiveness, diversity, uh, heterogeneous cities, and sustainable cities? So, we can have spatial strategies, like I've discussed before. We can have social strategies. We can have economic strategies. We can also have political strategies. Uh, but the best would be, to bring all of this together and have a mix of these strategies and not just one kind of strategy. So this kind of brings together some of these thinking around, how do we sort of look at socioeconomic challenges to spatial planning, but how do we also overcome some of these challenges using some of these ideas, say, cities for people that Jan Gell puts out, or even looking at, say, David Harvey's Right to the City, and sort of trying to understand how to sort of make participation work in cities in the real sense. So, with that, I'm going to conclude. Welcome to take in a few questions, comments.
Ma'am,
Yes.
regarding the railway station you were talking about and the platform thing, and regarding the design of the seats or this thing, and the coaches, uh, could there be a reason of uh, having a percentage of male and female population they would have considered, and how many people are using? Maybe that could be the reason for having just one coach for women's and more for men. Could be a population division between male and female. That could be a reason. I'm just asking, ma'am. Is
Absolutely. It started with that. Unfortunately, it has become a rule of thumb without sort of looking at how women's patterns and needs of travel are changing in our cities, right? So it's become
yeah.
something that you almost take for granted and you don't question. Has this changed? Have women's demands changed? For instance, are more women joining the workforce? For instance, what it doesn't capture is that more women work in the informal sector than in the formal sector, right? So when you're doing these calculations in the cities, what you get the data is for the formal sector participation and not for the informal sector, right? Which is why
Yes.
your design is again formalized in that manner. But you're not taking into consideration formal sector participation and therefore greater needs of women. So most of the women's coaches are chock full. You can't, you'll be dying, gasping for breath if you get into those women's coaches in the peak hour times, right? So those are the things that you need to think of, and the fact that women don't travel or don't need to travel, don't need to be mobile, during off peak hours, right? So you
Yeah.
just don't design those services during those hours. That needs to be challenged. You need to sort of see how these demands are being changed. So there's a need to sort of engage with how social dynamics sort of play out in our cities in the here and now. And I think that's what is sort of there's a gap in that understanding. We don't necessarily get it from the data that the limited data sets that planners work with.
Okay, ma'am. And regarding the articulation of the thoughts, ma'am, of the city and the social concerns which we have seen in the sketch, could we use this aspect, or could we use this idea of doing a social, like whenever we want to do any development in an area, can we take this as an opportunity of giving stakeholders a workshop section that they can draw, in the session they can draw like how you would like to see the city in future and what are your needs, so
I
that we
think,
can use this.
yeah,
Yeah.
absolutely. I think this is done in the American context where they have something called planning charrettes. I don't know, Sir might be familiar with the Australian context as well. Planning charrettes are where planners go with some kind of a design, but it's not. There might be alternatives or scenarios that they have, and they actually ask the communities which will be affected by those designs to then not just draw, but also comment on the designs that they have. So what then comes out is much more of something that is participatorily sort of worked out. Uh, so people have a way of voicing what they want as well in those designs. That's a
And it
different
will be
way.
easy for
Yeah,
Yeah, and it will be easy for us, ma'am, to understand what exactly the community is wanting for our,
exactly.
you know, yeah.
Exactly. This works at a scale of the neighborhood. This works at a scale of micro planning. This works at a scale of the city.
Yeah.
Definitely building complexes, and you could do that maybe even in slum settlements, communities, smaller communities. Um, this was tried out, not the drawing bit, but definitely an engagement which the Mumbai development plan, the current one that is in place, had a series of consultations at the ward level where they came up with the ward plans, right? They showed each reservation where the reservation was going to be located. They looked at, they said the number of reservations, where they're located, how much of planning, how much of parking, how much of, open space, etc., was going to come up. And they invited people from the ward to come and engage with those plans. This was not a requirement under the formal legislation of planning, right? Planning gives you, if your formal plan, you just come up with the plan, the master plan, you have 90 days to engage with it, right? Once the plan is made. But they did this before. They did it with the existing land use once, and then they did it with the proposed land use. So two times that they engaged with different stakeholder groups, and they engaged with citizens from the ward. This was not required, but this is something that people's engagement and also the politicians realized was an important tool, and MCGM realized was an important kind of tool to get more people on board and agree to the plan, right? And agree, or even change the plan before the plan came into being. Because if the plan comes into being and then you get into, comments, suggestions, etc., it can take years to actually, take all those recommendations on board. So why not do it earlier? Why not actually get into a participatory mode of planning? And this is what was kind of experimented with. We are a long way off from becoming fully participatory, but I think there are, like the Maybe Delhi campaign and the Mumbai example, I think there are ways in which people are now realizing the need to, as well, the importance of engaging with planning practice. And it's not just planners who are going to plan the cities.
Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much.
Yes. Yes. So,
Hello, ma'am. Good afternoon, ma'am.
yes, Shilpa.
Yes, ma'am. So I just wanted to add something to our discussion on idle cities, where we discussed regarding idle infrastructures and environment, regarding walkability, sustainability, resilience. So this is what I personally feel that in addition to all those idle infrastructures and environment, we also need the idle citizens who are
Mhm.
empowered to share and who are eager to participate in that process of planning, who are trying to make a change in their native place in which they are living.
Right.
And in the very first class of socio-economic dimensions, Abdul sir had said that planners are the persons who come to the people, and this is what makes planners different from engineers and architects. And
Mm-hmm.
he also said that we cannot exclude and include people.
Mm-hmm.
We need to understand the way they live and the way they use the infrastructures. So that's why I personally feel that planning can be used as one of the most important platforms and weapons which can tarnish all those social exclusions and marginalities which is present in the society. So
Very
that's
well
what I
said.
want to add.
Very well said, Shilpa, and I hope that happens. As you
Yes,
can
ma'am.
see, it's a very contested field, and I would say that planning is a very contested terrain. It's a complex process. It's an extremely messy process.
Yes, ma'am.
Information is not equally shared. There are big groups, big interests, capital which is interested in our cities, and they want to sort of use land in particular ways. Uh, and then there are people who want particular things from our cities. And sometimes these will contradict. And so I think the role of planners has become from, to actually drawing these plans, we're more sort of facilitators, and we have to engage in those messy discussions. We
Yes,
have
ma'am.
to sort of be able to sort of get people to talk to one another. But more importantly, I think use this as a political space to sort of encourage discussion, not close off discussion. There has to be space for discussion to emerge. And I think that's something that has to be made very clear. And I think that's local governments and politicians at the local level need to sort of also engage with the planning process in that sense. In Bombay, for instance, when we asked local councillors, what did the master plan say, they had no idea, but it would affect them once the plan came into the picture. It would affect them. So when the workshops were done, then they realized people actually understood what was going to happen, but some of these politicians were not even aware. So we said, why don't you use your space, your constituency, to have this kind of discussion? And I think the 74th Amendment Act also says that, we should encourage these kind of ward committee formation to sort of have these kind of discussions around planning at that lowest level. And I think we are also moving towards micro planning as a form of planning at the local level. So how that happens, whether it's going to be appropriated by big interest groups or not is something that we need to be wary of as planners. But certainly, these are spaces that need opening up and more discussion.
Yes, ma'am. We need to identify those different type of platforms for different type of people belonging to different category,
Yes,
so that they will feel comfortable to express their ideas and their aspirations and needs.
right, right.
Yes. Thank you, ma'am.
Yes, anybody else?
Yes, sir. I have a small query.
Yeah.
Hi, ma'am. It's Rakshna.
Yes,
So basically, urban planning is all about providing a balanced, facilities to everyone in terms of social as well economically. And so I have just one question. So how, as a planner, like how can we face or deal with the pollution kind of problem? Because we have a lot of pollution that happens at every pockets of cities. So over there we have, for example, if we have an industrial hub, so we'll be having a lot of industries that supports the human needs as well. The economy sector is also being pumped up, but that also affects the nearby people who reside there. So they either get affected or they lose their livelihood. So how can we face this problem as a planner? Like how can we move with planning, ma'am? Because I don't think I can take a stand on either side, because we need both basically. So in
hmm
that kind of situation, how can we proceed further?
it's a difficult, it's a wicked problem. That's what we say in planning. It's a wicked problem. There is no right or wrong answer. Because if you shift those units, what you're going to be landing up is, people might lose their jobs, livelihoods. And if you don't shift, then it means that, the kind of pollution is borne by everybody who's living in and around that area. So, what do we do? And I think one of the ways to sort of deal with is see whether you can shift them to a place where you also give them, not just jobs, access to jobs, but access to housing as well, or connect them to, to the housing in a particular manner, and you ensure that that rehabilitation takes place, right? But it's a terribly difficult situation, and I don't think there are any right or wrong answers. And this is something that planning has been dealing with for the longest times. Uh, but yes, I think if you had a public meeting, for instance, and there was, some kind of a public agenda, and people understood what was happening, there might be some suggestions from the people themselves to say, yes, we can move from here, provided you give us, uh, you know, this kind of rehabilitation in a different place. What is the compensation that they will seek? What is the kind of housing they will seek, which will make it worthwhile for them to move from there, right? But usually that compensation or rehabilitation is never really brought onto the table, because the question is, who will bear this cost of compensation, who will bear this cost of rehabilitation,
Okay.
right? Whether it's going to be the state, whether it's going to be the factory owners, whether it's going to be the people, paisa kahan se aane wala hai? So I think
Yeah.
that becomes the question. So I think if it's a public engagement, then really getting the government involved, your local government and the state government involved in that discussion, then it has to be a political decision that has to be made, right?
Okay. Yes. Okay. Thank you.
Who is next?
Yes. Any more questions, comments?
Ma'am,
Yes.
I'm Apurva.
Yes.
So, ma'am, throughout the presentation, we went, we talked about equitable distribution of resources. So equity, do urban planners as professionals aim for achieving equity and then later on achieve equality through the means of achieving equity at first? Is that the case?
Difficult again question, Apurva, but I think equity to some extent means a redistribution of resources, and that's always politically contested, right?
Hmm.
I think one of the ways in which the policy of national urban transport policy tries to do it is equitable distribution of road space, right? Where it's actually talking about giving more space to on the road space, giving more road space to public transport and non-motorized transport, which means that the transport space for private vehicles will sort of be reduced, right? Motorized private vehicles will reduce because you're not increasing the space of the roads, you're using that same space, but what you're giving more space on that road, on that existing road, to other users, right? But
Yes.
if you see in reality what we're doing, yes, we're creating cycle tracks, right? We're trying to create BRTS, which is the dedicated lanes for buses, but rarely are we trying to regulate motorized vehicles, right?
Hmm.
So, so what happens is a contestation on that road space, right? And who has might? The might rests with the people in their cars, right? There's a very famous case of putting in the BRTS corridor in Delhi, I remember. They were still experimenting with it. A few kilometers of BRTS had been made in Delhi. And basically, there was a public interest litigation in court uh, from very influential people in the city, particularly lawyers, etc., who said, government servants who said, we are the influential people in the city, we're making the city work, we need our space on the city's roads, so we can't have our road space being taken over by BRTS. And that was one of the principal ways that PIL led to, the BRTS being taken away. So,
So I mean that comes to that this thing that you just said. It is making me question that
right.
there is a do we really is equality desirable, because interdependence and segregation of labor is what makes the society thrive, right? So as compared,
Segregation, I wouldn't say segregation. Segregation, not in that sense. You're saying segregation of land use
no, in
between
terms of
people?
segregation of jobs,
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying segregation of laborers, not laborers.
Mm-hmm.
So that's what I'm trying to say. So, like, if we consider the fact that considering that they made the statement, the amount of taxpayers in India are very low as compared to the citizens that live in India.
Mm-hmm.
So, aren't their concerns completely valid considering their taxpayer money would be funding these projects?
But you and I, everybody else is also paying taxes in different ways. It's not
Yes.
just property tax that we're paying, right?
Hmm. Hmm.
So when you're talking about citizens, you're talking about only, say, from the property sense of the term.
Hmm.
But we pay taxes when we buy goods,
Hmm.
right? And that's going into the general pool as well,
Hmm. Hmm.
right? And as government, the government has, it cannot play sides, right?
Yeah.
It cannot play sides to the 10% taxpayers. It has to be, its approach has to be first, to the most vulnerable of all. That is the only way you'll sort of get ahead, because once you address those problems, the more critical problems, is when you can actually address the problems of the rest,
Hmm.
right? But if you start with the 10% problems, then the idea is your city will become more and more unequal over time. And those inequalities then have severe implications for housing, for environment, for transport, for congestion, all sorts of other problems, right?
So, ma'am, like I had this I wrote down a few things over
Sure,
the course of the presentation.
sure.
So, in the right to city slide,
Mhm.
It said that liberty to access urban resources, something
Mhm.
about that.
Mhm.
So why is it considered that a person has the liberty to access urban resources and not the right to access these urban resources?
So, so you're saying the difference between right and liberty,
Yeah,
right?
yeah, yeah.
Yeah. So I might have rights, which is there
Hmm.
on
Hmm.
paper, but I'm not at liberty to access it,
Hmm.
which means that there are different other groups, probably elite groups, influential groups, that is kind of getting in the way of exercising my rights,
Hmm.
right? Because they are far more influential in sort of getting, their way, right? So I think the idea is to sort of move away just from the concept of rights to sort of say, are you actually at liberty to do so,
Okay.
right? Yeah.
So, ma'am, how exactly is urban planning going to change this ideology where the rich becomes even more rich and the poor remains poor? Apart from, I mean, we have to overcome a lot of institutional barriers
Right.
and these biases that are present. So, off the top of your head, what do you think should be the priority? Like, how does a planner how much power does a planner have, considering we are working with the politicians, right?
um, you do and you don't.
Hmm.
Like I said, your work is as a facilitator, and as a facilitator, you are extremely powerful. Um and to sort of look at spaces where you go on increasing or sort of enhancing and empowering people's participation,
Hmm.
right? And to some extent, I think, and to some extent, the planners that I've come into contact with in real time in today's world. So, Champaka Rajagopalan, who's worked on the Mumbai development plan, and she's now, I think, she's also worked on the Bangalore master plan, was one of the prime sort of consultants on the Mumbai's development plan, and she was kind of instrumental in bringing this idea that the municipal corporation had to open up spaces of public participation before the plan was even published, and that's nowhere in the laws or regulations that that has to be done. And planners within MCGM were very, very skeptical of this, right? They didn't want to do this. They said, why are you inviting trouble,
Hmm.
right? But she opened, but she and her group of planners said, this will work to our benefit because we get to hear even before we create these plans, what the feeling on the ground is, what the needs on the ground is, because our data sets don't capture some of these tensions, some of these requirements. And so then they went on to do these multiple stakeholder workshops and these ward level consultations, and and the citizens groups were also involved, where they actually taught and educated people, uh, say rank citizens, slum dwellers, rickshaw pullers, into understanding what the master plan was or what the development plan was, and how their lives would be affected by this, right? So it came from both sides. It came from a bottom up push from the people, but it also had to come from a planner who saw merit in the fact that you push people, the planners themselves and the bureaucracy, to understand and enlarge the space of public participation, right?
Okay.
Right.
Okay, ma'am.
So yes and no, you do and you don't have power. So, but there are ways in which you can work around, and I think part of it comes from policy, from
Hmm.
top down, but part of it will also come from bottom up, which means people, citizens groups needs to push these things forward. But part of it will also come from planners when they open up these spaces, right? And they push for opening up these spaces.
Okay, ma'am. Thank you for the interesting presentation.
Okay, my pleasure.
Okay, let me thank all the friends who are very keen to listen and discuss and clarify all your queries. These are more relevant, and it's a very dynamic subject, as you all know that there is no one solution for one problem. So what we learned from this today's discussion, almost about 130 to 40 minutes, Dr. Ratula made a very interesting story of how to take the spatial planning into the perspective of spatial intervention as well as the social decision making, because that is what more concerned about. So we discussed in the class also that it is it's not one time learning and one time decision making. It is go on. No change takes place in the society overnight. So we know that what is the planning practice for so many years ago and now, and what we are aspiring to do in the future. There is always there is a change. There's a lot of transformation because the people change, the administration change, the governance change, the physical strategies, development strategies for physical development change, because this is all our concern. That is what important. And it is very, I would like to appreciate Dr. Ratula, because he was telling in the beginning, after 2 centuries, 20 years, I listened to very well designed as well as research class attended for you. Earlier you attended my class, but I think it is a very refreshing as well as it is very, I like the presentation and the points also very well, researched. It's not that taking points from some reference and then giving the class. That's what more important for a learner today, because it is what you have presented very rightly, that all those, it is knowledgeable, it was very informative, I can say, and most of the friends are really interested to discuss, but anyway, we have 60, 70 students, cannot speak on that particular time. So it was very, very interactive. And I think it's a very simple way of presentation. You have very, very clear illustrations and words. And it's really amazing to listen to you and taking lessons from your knowledge you share with our students. I think hopefully that all students will have a better, learning from these discussions today. And then there are many issues which I don't want to give an answer now. We will discuss in the class also. You can also keep in contact with madam. So always you can interact, and because of the why I have to invite her, because we have very few sociologist planners in the country. So it is very, very important, a person who is into the field of research and working for people, because of you also told, I'm also telling classes also that, so we have to connect with the people. We have to go to the people. We cannot expect people come to us all the time. We have to be, the planner has to connect with the people all the time. That's the way you will learn. You travel, or you make a participatory meeting, or you discuss everything. When you have a connection with the people, then only you will learn more, and that gives a input for your planning, which is very specific, and it is not just universal. You cannot make a social plan for social development plan for the country or the city or in the region. So anyway, it's very, very happy that you spare your time and then contributed your rich knowledge. And thank you so much for your time. And then we will stay in touch.
Yes.
And, hope you have a wonderful day ahead and then the year ahead. And then take care. Yeah. Hello.
Thank you, everyone. Thank you. I really enjoyed the interactions. Thank you for those amazing questions. Very interesting questions, pointed questions, difficult questions.
Yes.
I think, being a sociologist, you always must keep on questioning. And I think that's primarily, what we do. And as planners, we try and think of solutions, but it's also important to keep asking the more difficult questions. So yes, thank you, class. Thank you, sir, once again.
Yes.
Hope to see you in person sometime soon.
Yes, very well. Yes.
Yes. Take care, everyone.
Thank you all.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye-bye. Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Bye.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you, ma'am.